You're in the water loop.
Waterloop is made possible in part by grants from Springpoint Partners and the Walton Family Foundation.
Waterloop.
Hi, this is Travis with Waterloop. Water conservation is very important to me, and I bet it is to all of you. That's why I use High Sierra shower heads in my house, and I'm so happy to have them as a supporter of this podcast. High Sierra carries the EPA WaterSense label for efficiency and uses 40% less water than conventional low-flow shower heads. 40%. The model I have uses just 1.5 gallons per minute. And because of their unique nozzle design, it's patented. Nobody else has it. It maximizes efficiency of water and energy use, but doesn't sacrifice on performance. You still get a powerful shower. Use promo code LOOP20 for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
Waterloop.
The Waterloop podcast is sponsored by Flume. It's the perfect device for tracking your home's water use in real time on your smartphone. It's so easy to use. You just attach a small device to your water meter using a band, the same way you put a watch on your wrist. Then you connect to Wi-Fi, you download the app, and you're up and running. It's as simple as that. You don't need a plumber. You don't need to cut into any of your pipes or water lines. Very easy to set up. Then you can set water budgets, how much you want to use each day or week. It'll keep track of that. It'll tell you what's going on in your house with water use minute by minute. It'll send alerts to you if there's excessive water use or if it suspects a leak. In fact, when I installed Flume at my house, it told me almost right away about a leak. I was losing 1 gallon of water every 6 minutes. I'm honestly not sure when I would have found that without Flume. You can use promo code WATERLOOP for 10% off at flumewater.com.
You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. I am delighted for this episode to be joined by a former colleague of mine. We worked together at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for a little more than 6 years, I think. I'm with Jeff Peterson. He is also the author of a book, A New Coast, which I have here with me, and we're going to talk a lot about today. But Jeff, it's really good to see you again.
And it's great to talk to you, Travis. It's been too long since we worked at EPA, and I look forward to chatting today.
Yeah, I think maybe even the first time I met you was when I was at the Chesapeake Bay program, and we were working on the new the executive order came down for a new strategy for the Chesapeake Bay, and I think you were at the Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ, then, and a lot of people pointed me toward you, especially as it came to writing and crafting a document, that new strategy document, which was an effort by a lot of different people, but and I think that your prowess for writing and policy is captured in this book here, A New Coast. Of all the things you could have written a book about after leaving EPA, why did you choose this?
Yeah, well, I left EPA, in 2017, and it just happened that when I left in September, we were looking at 3 major hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, hitting just 1, 2, 3 right during that fall of 2017, and those had tremendous impact and really astonishing scope and breadth of impact. And I knew from the work I had been doing at EPA that storms and sea level rise in working together were a huge risk to the coast, but those 3 storms working together really kind of got my attention, and I felt like, well, it's really important to think about what can be done, what the government can do, state, local, but also federal government can do to get better prepared for these storms and the rising sea level that's coming along behind them. And I put some ideas on paper, and Island Press was good enough to work with me to help pull it together as a book, and it came out in November of 2019. So
the thing I love about the book, and that fits with this podcast, is really the focus on solutions and a path forward, and kind of what some recommendations are for improving resilience for our coast. But let's spend a little time first on that problem definition so we can set up those solutions. Talk a little bit about climate change and its impact on coastal storms and rising seas, and what's that doing to the U.S. coast?
right. So there's two factors to kind of keep in mind as you look at this problem. One, of course, is the devil we know, which is coastal storms. And climate change is affecting coastal storms. We're seeing more intense coastal storms, including in the Atlantic Basin. And there's more evidence that storms are producing more rainfall than they did in the past on average. And they're intensifying more rapidly as they approach the coast. And that makes them harder to predict where exactly they're going to have landfall. So these storms are, we've always had them, but they're going to be worse thanks to climate change. But they can be devastatingly harmful, both to loss of human life, but also damage to property. We've seen huge impacts from over the last, say, roughly 40 years. There's estimated $1 trillion of storm impacts in the U.S. Hurricane Harvey by itself was $125 billion
Wow.
damage. So those were really important impacts, and a lot of those damages are storm surge related. So you add that to that sea level rise, and you get a real 1-2 punch. And in the future coming decades, that's going to make those losses that we've seen go even worse.
Yeah. Well, since I left DC, I've relocated to Wilmington, North Carolina. Our state hockey team is the Carolina Hurricanes for a reason. The past 3 hurricane seasons here, we've had hurricanes hit. We had Florence in 2018. We had Dorian in 2019, and we had a little clipper, if you will, Isaias, come through this past year. So I chose to live here by the coast. I knew what was going on, but I have seen firsthand that hurricane just push on the East Coast for sure. How is the nation really unprepared for coastal storms and rising seas?
So there's sort of 2 questions you have to ask there. One is, are the programs that we have put in place to deal with particularly coastal storm disasters and other related impacts, are they helping us, or maybe are they actually causing some problems? And it turns out that the 2 biggest programs in this area, the National Flood Insurance Program and our disaster relief programs, they do a lot of good, but they're also making it harder in some ways to be well prepared for coastal storm surge and related sea level rise impacts. In the case of the flood insurance program, by providing subsidized federally available flood insurance for people who are living in coastal areas at risk both of storm surge but also in the future sea level rise, we're really sending them the wrong message, that it's safe to live in these areas, or they might conclude that because the government's supporting them in doing that. And we need to turn that message around. And in the case of disaster relief programs, we as a country have been incredibly generous in responding when disasters happen and helping communities and individuals get back on their feet. At the same time, we haven't invested enough in preparing for these disasters and making sure that we minimize the impacts when disasters do happen. And we can do so much better by taking some of the money that we're investing in the after the storm relief costs and putting it more upfront into avoiding the damages and preparing for these risks in the first place. So if we could just fix those two existing programs, we would be much better prepared.
Hmm.
In addition, we have other valuable programs like the Coastal Zone Management Program, the Coastal Barriers Resources Act, the National Estuaries Program, which you and I remember from EPA, that are doing good things here, but most of them were designed and set up prior to a real understanding of what impact sea level rise is going to have on the coast. So they're not really organized to deal with sea level. So we don't have a good stable of programs designed to deal with the risks that we understand better today. And we need to update and amend and extend those programs.
Yeah, every time you see a hurricane hit or one of these things, there's a pretty much Congress in quick form, right, authorizes, or maybe I don't know if it's the federal government, they provide a lot of money. A big check right away goes out, instead of maybe following that old adage of an ounce of prevention being worth more than a pound of cure. Another place this burden falls is on states and municipalities and even the business community. How do they struggle right now with the forces that are acting on our coast?
Well, there's a lot of creative work going on in the states and in some local governments, and even some businesses are increasingly conscious of the risk to physical assets on the coast. I guess I could just mention a couple of states, I think, that have done a pretty good job of looking at the problem and beginning to kind of put together measures to be better prepared. California has done a pretty commendable effort. Over on the East Coast, a state like Maryland has actually done a pretty good job of understanding the risks and putting programs in place to be better prepared, as have some other states. But not every state is moving along that track equally successfully, and some are kind of lagging behind. And as a country, to be better prepared, we really need to bring all the states along. And states need to be working with local governments and supporting their local governments in these efforts. And there are individual cases of local governments that have really grabbed a hold of these problems, including sea level rise. Communities like Charleston have actually put good plans together and are working with the federal government to explore what they can be doing in terms of protection and other measures. So there are good news stories to tell. But there are also a lot of communities that are really not prepared and not even really understanding the risks that they're facing. And again, the job is, I think, to bring the whole country more along, not to have a few outstanding success stories seem like they're bringing a solution to the entire country when they're not yet.
Yeah. Well, I know with Charleston, I mean, I've kind of followed the news lately where they're looking to build a big seawall even. And, so they are being proactive, but boy, the investment that's required for that and the work that's required, and that's incredible. So the solution side, again, this is what I really like about your book, A New Coast, is that after you comprehensively lay out the problems that are out there, you make some solid, tangible, specific recommendations for ways to try to address some of this and build a new coast, if you will. So let's start working through those. A framework for a national storm and sea level rise program. What would the parts of that look like?
Yeah, so let me just give you the sort of high level tour of some of the key elements. The first one is kind of an easy one. It's just providing some better federal leadership. We had some of that during the Obama administration, almost none during the Trump administration, but I think we can turn a new page now with the Biden administration and expect that federal agencies should work together and have mechanisms to consult with the public about what we need to be doing and how fast we need to be doing it as we go forward to build coastal flood resilience. So that's one. The second is we need to take some new actions. One area where I think there's a lot of promise is to improve the requirements for disclosure of flood and sea level rise risk when a property along the coast is sold. So some states have requirements now. They vary. Some are better than others, but a lot of states don't have anything. And a national requirement would be a huge step forward in terms of educating people about the risks. We also ought to be limiting development in those coastal areas that are most immediately at risk of sea level rise and permanent inundation. So there's a lot of energy and desire to build in these coastal areas, but putting property and new assets and infrastructure into areas that we know are going to be inundated is really just not a good investment for the private parties, but also for the communities who are going to get stuck with the problem of dealing with that when the sea level rises. So those are a couple of new ideas.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to mention, I've also been learning about in Norfolk and the Hampton, Virginia Beach area, how they're looking at managed retreat, right, from these areas that are going to be permanently inundated. Like, stop developing there. Let's not reinvest. Let's pull back to higher ground. And I mean, that's a tough sell in some ways for a community, but it's necessary in some situations, right?
Well, I think really that is the pressing, most immediate problem that we're going to have to face, and the proposal that I've been encouraging people to look at is that we need to support a state and local planning process that's able to review the options that are available. So most people immediately think of, well, if I'm going to respond to the sea level rise, I should build a seawall. For instance, you mentioned that in the case of Charleston as one option. Another option is to elevate buildings so that, at least for something like storm surge, as opposed to permanent sea level rise, you have some protection. But as you say, a third and in many ways both more effective but also more controversial approach is to step back from the risky areas and move to higher ground. But working through those and really coming up with an understanding of what's at risk, including what people's personal risk is by staying in areas that aren't safe, even if there is supposed to be protection from a built structure, or what a built structure as opposed to moving back to higher ground would cost, and who's going to pay for that. And how do you treat disadvantaged communities and minorities in the process so that they feel like they're getting a fair deal? All of those questions need to be considered in a thoughtful planning process, and the federal government can provide the funding and the technical support that's needed to do careful planning that allows all of these different options to be well thought out in each local case. I hope in a lot of cases, communities would decide that their best long-term strategy is to relocate, but to just start with, well, the federal government says everybody has to move, is probably not the best strategy to get us to a reasonable outcome that everyone's comfortable with. So I think we do need to make an investment in supporting the state and local governments in dealing with these problems. And then not just paying for the plan, but actually delivering the money that will help implement that plan so it doesn't just sit on a shelf.
Well, that's another big chunk of your solutions section here, and of course, it's about money, right? This is, as we've already mentioned a couple of times, a lot of this is very expensive. How do we go about then funding coastal storm and sea level rise preparedness?
Well, there are a couple things to think about here. One is that when you think about federal expenditures and what we put out annually in terms of the federal budget in a program like this, um, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're trying to make an investment that's going to save us money in the long run. And when we look at the costs of uh, the storms and driven more ultimately by higher sea levels, we see that those costs are estimated by the Congressional Budget Office to be as high as $20 billion annually. So an investment, even if it were several billion dollars or even as much as $10 billion a year in better preparing the coast would save the federal government money, not to mention save local communities and individuals living in coastal communities a lot of heartache, a lot of damages, a lot of rebuilding if we could get a good plans in place and implement them. So I think really what we need to do is convince the Congress that this is a good investment to put money into dealing with this problem up front rather than put twice or three times the amount of money into building it back several times over again in the context of disaster relief.
Yeah. Would you mention it was like $1 trillion over the past couple decades that have been spent on some of these coastal disaster responses and rebuilding. So there you go. If you can cut down on that by spending on prevention and adaptation, that's worthwhile. There's a couple other specifics that are kind of under the funding piece that I wanted to learn a little bit more about that I'm not familiar with too much. Coastal hazards removal funding. What's that?
Right. So when you look a lot on the coast, you'll see some areas that are pretty well developed right up to the high tide line and are at a low elevation and are exposed to storms, but also to the sea level rise that we're going to be seeing, which we're looking at, anywhere in the nature of 2 to 3 feet by 2050 and 3 to 6 feet by 2100. So those properties are at risk of being abandoned as the sea level rises. They are served by water systems, they're served by electric power, they're served by roads. It's going to be increasingly hard to maintain those services as sea level rises. And ultimately, people will have to leave those houses. And as the water comes in, we really don't want to leave infrastructure, including buildings, just standing in 3 feet of water. We need to tear them down and remove that. So that's basically a big decommissioning job. And that's going to be a big cost to the federal government, pretty much any way you look at it.
Yeah. I guess a related one, I'm curious about Coastal Property Price Stabilization Fund. I assume this is kind of about the way real estate on the coast and so forth is. What's going on there, and what would be a good approach?
Right. So there are somewhere in the nature of 2 million individual residential properties at risk in the 3 to 4 foot sea level rise scenario. And the individuals who own those properties have a tremendous amount of money wrapped up. Their personal finances many times are pretty much dependent on the value of their home. Right now, we're already seeing declines in the value of coastal property because the risks are becoming more and more evident. And so people are at risk of either they're selling now and getting what they can get for their property, or they're holding on in the hopes that maybe it won't be so bad, or maybe someone will come along and offer to buy the property later. The federal government needs to provide a little bit of a buffer to not just the individual homeowners, but because communities rely on property taxes for many of these properties. A loss of the property and its ability to pay property taxes is going to hurt the local community. So what we'd like to do, and what I've been proposing, is that the federal government get out front of this problem instead of doing buyouts only after the storm has come and destroyed your property, we should be doing buyouts more proactively so that we purchase properties that we know are in the long term going to be at risk of inundation by sea level rise, but aren't at an immediate risk. It may be 30 or 40 years out, but we can buy the property now with debt financing from the federal government and have that property stay on the books as a lease back to the homeowner if they want to stay while it's still safe, or perhaps as something that's available as a lease to another personal property owner. And some of that money would be repaid. So it'd be like a revolving fund. For instance, we have revolving funds for municipal sewage treatment plants, but this would be more for an individual property, and the government would be repaid and then loan that money out again to other properties that are further back, but as sea level rises will increasingly be at risk.
Very, very interesting. I guess the last part of your book is where you really talk about the elements that need to come together to launch this campaign for a new coast. And I'm always curious about who needs to be involved to make something like this happen. You call it the cast of key players. Who needs to be on this?
Yeah, so it's going to take a big kind of cooperative effort to convince Congress and state and local governments to really come to grips with this problem. I think there are a lot of people who have an important role to play. The academic community, for instance, the Sea Grant program has tremendous kind of capacity across the coast to help explain these issues and think through solutions. But also professionals in the business of coastal development, everyone from lawyers to real estate agents to engineers to architects and planners. So that whole professional class, I think, has a critical role to play. And then environmental groups have been pretty active about advancing solutions. Everyone from the Environmental Defense Fund to the Natural Resources Defense Council to Surfrider, I think are working on different parts of this issue. And of course, there are some organizations working more specifically on sea level rise. And I think they have some good ideas that need to be considered. So there are a lot of different important players in addition to just governments and the private sector.
Yeah, yeah. Two other pieces in the campaign that jumped out at me too is this phrase, a positive vision. What's meant by that?
Well, when you look at this problem, it's easy to kind of focus on the actuarial side. Well, there's so many dollars of losses, or even so many lives that are lost to storms every year. But it's harder to think about, well, what is our coast after we have some serious sea level rise? What is it going to look like? And how can we imagine designing a new coast that represents our values? And so we would want to think about how to have communities that are still connected to the coast, but are safer than they are today. No one wants to live where they have a risk of their home being washed out in the next big storm. So I think we can have safer communities, but we can also have communities where ecosystems are better protected, wetlands and marshes and beaches. We need to do more to make sure those systems are safe and functional and sustained as a result of sea level rise. So we also need to think about disadvantaged communities and how to make sure that not just we don't have solutions that just work for the wealthier people in a community, but work for everyone. So things like making sure that a new coast has amenities like better access to the coast than maybe we've had in the past are all possibilities that can I think, encourage everyone to think about, well, this isn't just all bad news. There are some good news things that can happen as this transition is forced on us that can actually work to our benefit if we start now to think through how to make that happen.
A lot of positive opportunities, right? And then the last one, citizen action. This is a big project. This is a big task. You mentioned a lot of the in addition to government, the nonprofit community and the business community and all these and experts in environmental planning all need to be part of this. Why is there need to be citizen action, and what role is there for citizens in transforming our coast?
Well, I think citizens really are a critical part of the equation, and we're not going to get a successful transition to a new coast without citizens who love the coast and who live along the coast taking a really active and informed role. So really the first thing citizens can do is educate themselves about, well, what is the sea level rise risk and what is it in my community? Because it's not the same everywhere. It does vary along the coast. And then work within your community to help others become better educated, and also to think about, well, what could we do as a community? But as an individual, if you're a professional, for instance, a lawyer or a planner or an architect, you can actually help by bringing understanding of these coastal risks to the jobs that you're working on. If you're someone who has some money and you invest in businesses and own stock, you can push for corporate disclosure of what some of the risk of sea level rise and storms are to the physical assets of the companies you own stock in. And probably one of the key things is just to be articulate in understanding and supporting remedies at the local and state level, and calling your congressman to say, you need to do more about this, and we on the coast need your help to think through these problems, and we don't want to just spend a lot of money on our own interest. We think that we can get a better coast that is going to cost the federal government a lot less in the future in terms of reduced costs from storms and other impacts if we do this right. So we need your help.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, I'm so glad we caught up. Your book it's just a wealth of information. I think that the current administration could pick it up and take that framework section and just say, let's go. Let's just start checking this stuff off and going for it. But yeah, really appreciate your time. I hope people pick up the book, and I hope you keep doing well.
Well, thank you very much, Travis, and same to you. It's been great chatting with you.
Waterloop, waterloop, waterloop.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to today's episode. A special thanks to Waterloop supporters Spring Point Partners and the Walton Family Foundation. The Waterloop podcast is sponsored by High Sierra Showerheads, the smart, stylish way to save energy, water, and money while enjoying a powerful shower. Save 20% with promo code WATERLOOP at highsierrashowerheads.com. Waterloop is also sponsored by Flume, the smart water monitor that tracks your home's water use in real time and provides data on your smartphone. Save 10% with promo code WATERLOOP at flumewater.com. If you like Waterloop, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on social media and visit waterloop.org to sign up for updates.
Waterloop, waterloop, waterloop.